and the film. Two things that are often set up by the skeptics to take shots at. We'll examine some of those criticisms as we go along through the process of looking at what this evidence suggests. All right, so for me, this began really in earnest in 1996 when I was taken to the foothills of the Blue Mountains just outside of Walla Walla, Washington, in the southeastern corner of the state. A little dog tail of the Blue Mountains that sticks up into southeastern Washington. And interestingly, since both I and Dave have drawn attention to the significance of rainfall, this area receives a very appreciable amount of rainfall by comparison to the surrounding area. It sticks up just high enough, not a huge range. Highest peak there, Lewis Peak, is over 5,000 feet, but just high enough to catch those westerlies and drop a lot of precipitation. So a very rich and very productive habitat. In '96, a gentleman named Paul Freeman, who's been the target of some criticism, some attacks on his character, which are undeserved. He's not pristine in his integrity, but I think for the most part, the evidence that he has accumulated over a decade of personal investigation is really quite astounding. And much of it now resides, in the way of footprint cast, resides in my laboratory. We showed up on his porch. My brother and I had actually been on a trip to visit Dr. Grover Krantz at Washington State University, more or less on a lark. I'd been home in Boise with my extended family for a weekend, and while the wives were off spending our money, we turned to each other and said, why don't we go over and visit Grover? It's only a few hours drive, about 5 hours drive north of Boise there, up in Poland. Anyway, to make a long story short, on our way home, we stopped in to visit Paul Freeman. And I asked if he would show me some of his footprint casts. He and I had talked by telephone previously, so it wasn't completely out of the blue, but this visit was totally unscheduled, unannounced. And he, after showing me some of his casts, said, well, would you like to see some fresh footprints? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, I found some just this morning. In fact, that's where I was coming from when you pulled up, and almost arrived at his front curb at about the same time. And I thought, well, what have I got to lose? So we went up, and sure enough, strung out along this farm access road was a string of footprints. And they were very fresh, given the weather conditions, which was overcast and drizzly, kind of a day like today, after rain over the weekend. They must have been laid down in the wee hours of that very morning. When I knelt down, I could see dermatoglyphics. I could see skin ridge detail in some of the toes that was quickly fading. It only lasts, especially in those conditions, for a few hours. And even those ridge details will be pulled out and flattened by the effects of gravity itself, depending on the extent of moisture in the soil. But the point is, I'll make reference back to these tracks. A couple of examples from this trackway, which consisted of at least 45 very clear footprints, are on the back table back there. Oh, and I should mention, because I get the impression that some of you may not be familiar with how a silent auction runs. I don't get up here, with duct tape over my mouth and wave my hands to auction off those things. The notion is, if you're interested in any of those artifacts, you can write in a bid with your name and the amount you're bidding. And then your neighbor, if they want it more than you do, or more badly than you do, can outbid you. And then at 4:30, the bidding is closed, and I simply go back and circle the last bid. So if you're interested, I don't want somebody who is interested and waiting for some event to participate in it to miss out. So if you are interested after the talk, you're welcome to go back there and have a look and see if there is something you'd like to see. Okay. So let's leave that just sitting for a moment and turn to this question of footprints. Now, if there are any of those of you that may be sort of on the fence about this whole subject, you may say, well, yeah, but what about that guy who died and after he died, it was said that he was responsible for making all these footprints with carved wooden feet. Well, his name was Ray Wallace, And this is his brother. This is Ray, not Ray, this is, no, sure. This is one of the family. I spoke with a gentleman named Mike Wallace, who was Ray's son. But, if a picture could speak 1,000 words, the expression on his face would seem to tell it all. He seems to be quite confident that he's pulled one over on us, or they have pulled one over on us. When Ray passed away, Ray Wallace was the foreman of the construction site in Bluff Creek in 1958 when footprints were documented, and a cast was made by Jerry Crew, which we'll see a picture of, taken down into Willow Creek, and then appeared in the Humboldt Times newspaper, and was picked up by the AP Wire Services and was on front pages all across the country. So when Ray Wallace passed away, his family came forward out of concern that individuals like myself would no longer be embarrassed by our gullibility, and they were going to come clean and share their story. That they, in fact, with these very simplistic hardwood feet, had tromped around all over the western United States, from California to British Columbia, and had left tracks over the decades. And that all the tracks were of their origin, except for maybe a few copycats, copycat users. Including, they asserted, the original tracks from the Bluff Creek construction site back in 1958. The problem is, they obviously weren't familiar with those tracks, because here is a newspaper photo of one of the 16-inch tracks, 16 to 17-inch, depending on their measurement. From that site, this one was actually photographed and cast by one of the reporters from the Humboldt Times. It's a very dynamic print. You can see, kind of see across here. Realize this is an enlargement of a newsprint photo, cleaned up just a little bit. But right across here was a stick that the foot stepped upon and clearly conformed to, molded to. Now, if it was a piece of plank carved in the shape of a foot, a high point here in the center of the foot would have caused the foot to teeter-totter over it, unless it pushed it all the way into the ground, which it didn't. And all you'd have were impressions of the heel and at the furthermost parts of the toes. But instead, we have a very dynamic print with very anatomically correct toes that are clearly articulated by individual toe stems to the foot, and so on. Ignoring the fact that this is only 15 inches long as compared to 16 or 17. Too many things like that. Here it is compared to another cast. This one, it was the one that was actually cast by Jerry Crew. He was a cat skinner, ran a caterpillar, a very level-headed guy, very sober, serious guy, and by description of his peers. And no-nonsense sort of guy, and he comes out one morning, and these tracks that have been showing up, and this time were in a big circle all around his caterpillar. And so he was curious enough about this that he went down and talked to the local taxidermist, who was the local authority on wildlife sign, who happened to be Bob Titmus, who plays a role later on, and asked Bob. He had taken a piece of cardboard and cut out the outline of the footprint, took it down to Titmus and asked if he recognized, well, what could have made this track? Could have been a bear? It did not be a bear that he was familiar with. He didn't know what it was. Explained to him how to make a plaster cast. Gave him some materials, because taxidermists often use the plaster to mold the body form and so forth, to stretch the skin over and so on. So it was ready authority on how to use this material. So Jerry went back and made a cast, brought it down, and the newspapers got wind of it. And that's how the story of Bigfoot, or at least the term Bigfoot, as applied to this phenomenon, originated. You can see again, this is to scale, there's just no comparison. There's just really no comparison. But there is a lot of similarity between this 15-inch track and the carved wooden foot. But it's certainly not an exact replica. Well, with a little sleuthing, it was very easy to determine that the Wallaces had a copy of this track that Bob Titmus had eventually made. Titmus, upon seeing this track, became very interested in the subject. Spent a lot of time traipsing around in the mountains of California there, and found on his own many sets of footprints which he cast. And he had an interesting collection that now resides in the Willow Creek China Flats Museum. So my suggestion is that this is in fact an attempt to duplicate this track, and I'll show you why I think that. Ray claimed that he wasn't the first to make these tracks. He actually gave credit to this gentleman named Grant Mullins. They had been loggers together back in the early days when they both were living up in Washington State. Ray was originally from Toledo, Washington, and retired back to there. But you can see again, here's Grant Mullins' carvings. And even Ray said, Grant's carvings wouldn't fool anybody. They look like blocks of wood. They just squared off toes, and he said they're just so simplistic. He said that never fooled scientists. But Ray would make something a little more interesting, I guess you could say. These are carvings, but he would sell them as tracks, as casts. He had a little curio shop in Toledo that he sold these things at, roadside shop. And this was his signature footprint. You can recognize them, and occasionally if you come across them in literature or online, you see one, you know it's his because of these exaggerated curves and split, well, here's a split ball, and this flexion crease, and toes that are lined up like they're made with a ruler, straight lined and individually carved, nice little round egg-shaped toes stuck on here with no toe stems, no evidence of articulation. Oh, and by the way, these are missiles that Sasquatch manufactures to hunt deer with, according to Ray. Many of you are rock hounds, you know that they're just simple geodes. But, as Barnum would say, there's a sucker born every moment, I guess. Here's another one that might also have been an inspiration for the carving of this particular footprint, which the Wallaces put forward to the press, because it's the more realistic looking one. It's the one that looks more like a Bigfoot track, much more than those on the previous page. Even down to this kind of scraping here, it looks very similar. But yet you start comparing the shape of the heel. This one's much broader, much narrower here. The bulge out here, the side's missing. The way the toes are conformed is different. I mean, there's some superficial similarities, but those similarities in my mind are more readily explained as an attempt to copy something like this by Ray Wallace. And we know that, again, in this case, this is a track that Al Hodgson cast up at, not Tishnane, let's see, I can't now go blank on the location, the site. I think it was on Bluff Creek itself, but way back in 1963, he displayed it in his hardware store. Al Hodgson's been mentioned earlier. He had a store there in Willow Creek. So many people asked him about it and asked about the possibility of getting a duplicate. He made a mold and then generated a number of duplicates, which he then sold for a modest amount through the hardware store. So copies of that cast are circulating around, probably about 100 copies. And unfortunately, they do pop up. Hoaxes do happen. There's no question. And I've uncovered several hoaxes. And interestingly, 2 of those hoaxes were instances where the unwitting hoaxer had taken a copy of Al Hodgson's cast that they'd bought, and used it as a template to make a footprint. Or even tried to pawn off the cast itself as an original specimen. But with the familiarity that I gained over by accumulating and assembling the large number of casts which I have, those stick out like sore thumb, and it's very easy to uncover. Now, jump back for a moment to Walla Walla, Washington, and here's some of the tracks that I examined. And one feature in particular really jumped out at me as I looked at these tracks and sat there kind of pinching myself like, am I really seeing these things? They were so clear, they were so compelling and impressive. And that is this feature right across here. This is a ridge, and it's a little hard to see because of the flash that I used and reflecting off of this wet mud. But right there is actually a raised kind of a hump that runs all the way across. Here you can see it very clearly as a more dramatic extrusion of material. The heel imprints back here. And then you've got this bit right here. This is a pressure ridge, or a pressure release artifact, where as pressure is concentrated over the front part of the foot during the latter part of the step, material is squished out from underneath that front part of the foot, or simply humped up here as a ridge. And I thought, because even though I wasn't really involved in this subject, I was familiar to a fair extent because I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I knew about the stories about Sasquatch. I had gone to see Roger Patterson's movie when I was a young fellow of about 11 years of age. When he came up through Spokane, on the circuit showing his documentary, and he showed it in the Spokane Coliseum in 1968. And I had read some of the books. John Green's niece turned out to be my librarian in Spokane, and she had some of his books on the shelf, and so through her I got a little more acquainted with some of the literature as well. At that point I was already interested in cavemen and primates and human evolution and all that, and so this was kind of the notion of an ape man or a primitive human or a bipedal ape really appealed to my young mind at that time. Here is my attempt to reconstruct, to illustrate what's happening, how that pressure ridge could be explained. The distinguishing, if you go first to the human though, the human on the right here, the distinguishing hallmark of the human foot is the longitudinal arch, the arch that runs the length of the foot. So it's like a vault, and when you're standing on the ground, you're bearing weight primarily on the heel and on the ball of the foot, mostly between the first and the fifth digits in particular, because there's a little bit of a medial arch too that runs from side to side, or a transverse arch, excuse me. When we walk, the bones here in the instep, or the midfoot, they twist in a certain way so that the surfaces lock together, and it makes that length of the foot rather stiff, and hence a very effective lever. Okay, so you all understand the principles of leverage. With that elongated lever, this is basically the same adaptation you see to a much greater extreme in things like cats and dogs that walk up on their toes instead of on the flats of their feet. You realize that part of your dog that sticks up back that way is actually the heel. Not a backwards knee, it's actually the heel sticking up in the air. Well, because humans are uniquely adapted amongst primates for endurance walking and running, more than any other, literally any other primate, in fact, more than many other mammals, with the proper training, with the potential, the physiological potential is there. We have adaptations for that kind of running behavior. And with that running behavior, then, we shorten our heel so that it's more of a speed lever. That way, just a little bit of movement of the heel translates into a lot of movement down here. It's just a matter of leverage ratios. The Sasquatch foot, it appears, retains a more primitive characteristic. Yes, superficially, it resembles a human foot in that it's lost the divergence of the big toe. It doesn't stick out there to the side like a thumb. It's lined up with the other toes. But that's a very superficial characteristic. In the interior of the foot, particularly the midfoot here, the joints don't have the same modification that the human foot shows. Those bones don't screw into a locked position. Instead, they remain, they remain quite flexible. And this allows, well, we'll come to that in just a minute. This allows the midfoot to flex right across here. And so when the heel comes up, it comes up by itself. All the weight now is over this part of the foot. And then pressure causes a pressure release. I'm in the way of some of you over here. Causes a pressure release here and humps up that ridge back here behind that joint, that pair of joints. Now, here's another example from the footprints in Walla Walla. This wasn't just simply a pressure ridge, but in this case there was only half of a footprint. There was no heel imprint back here. Now think about it. If you were to be at the beach and or at the reservoir or whatever, and you went running barefoot down a sandy stretch, sprinting as fast as you could, you'd be up on the balls of your feet, and you would leave a very abbreviated looking track, just the front part of the foot and the toes. And you'd be balancing essentially on your arch, on the end of your arch rather. Since the Sasquatch doesn't have an arch that will screw into a locked position, its foot collapses into flexion, and this entire front part of the foot makes contact instead of just the tips of the bones here, the metatarsals they're called. And that produces what I call a half track. And that's what we see right here. In this case, at this point, something had spooked this individual. It was walking, and if you had noticed on that first slide, every second right step was angled out about 45 degrees. And I sat there puzzled over that for a while. I hadn't thought about what would have caused that. Would it be some irregularity in the joint, something odd? I didn't realize what it was until a couple months later we took a family vacation to the Oregon coast. Once I got the kids building sandcastles, I wandered off on my own and started following people, looking at their footprints. And after I got a couple of nasty glares, I decided I better just look at my own footprints. And so, when I would be walking along, every once in a while I would look back over my shoulder to see how my tracks looked. And I started noticing that my right foot was angled out at 45 degrees. Every time I had looked over my shoulder, my right foot angled out 45 degrees. So I think what was happening is this individual had made a hairpin turn away from the road, gravel road, so it's Saturday night, early Sunday morning, teenagers are up there in the hills, partying or whatever teenagers do, and down comes a car, I can envision. This individual decides it can't go the way it wanted to, which was follow that road right up onto the ridge, and then it was about 200 yards from the tree line. Instead, it wheeled around and headed back for cover along the drainage ditch that it had followed through this farming field from the Mill Creek watershed or drainage down around the bend a little ways. And as it took off, so as it's walking away briskly, it's looking over its shoulder to monitor the progress of the headlights coming down, and then it decided it needs to run, and so its stride doubled in length. And as it doubled in length, the footprints took on this appearance. And one of those half tracks is back there on the table. All right, so here's a real brief anatomy lesson so you can kind of appreciate this. Here's the point of flexion that I'm talking about. And we'll not worry about the names of these bones, but just realize that there's these two joints right through the instep. But in the human, those can, like I said, will twist, and their overlapping surfaces are just kind of like shingles, and they lock together. The ligaments hold it tight. In the chimpanzee, whose skeleton is illustrated here, those joints are not so overlapping. And instead, when they twist, they just simply pivot around each other. They don't have any overlapping surfaces that will lock together. And that's because the principal adaptation in the great apes is what we call grasp climbing. If you've ever seen, a chimp go zipping up a tree, it uses its foot to grasp onto that vertical support. And so, in order to not disrupt its grip, the propulsive part of the foot, back here, the lever of the heel, is somewhat separated or uncoupled somewhat, unlocked from the prehensile, the grasping part of the foot. All right, now we can see that kind of action take place in the chimpanzee foot when it walks on the ground as well. And this is called the mid-tarsal break. We did some studies. I said, well, this phenomenon, this function is mentioned in the literature, but there's no good experimental data that has really documented this. So I got together with one of my former colleagues. She was still a graduate student back at Stony Brook. And she was doing her thesis on the plantar pressures of chimpanzees. In this case, it's actually walking quadrupedally. You can see in the knuckles right here. But the point is, here's the chimpanzee walks along, and the trace is essentially the same whether it's walking quadrupedal or bipedal, so it illustrates it just fine. It walks on this pressure-sensitive plate here, or pad, and the computer screen then shows the pixels of individual cells of pressure, the pressure sensors, The hotter colors mean the higher pressures, and the cooler colors the lower pressures. So you can see the outline of the heel here down the outside edge of the foot. They tend to walk on the outer edge of their feet. And here it's going extending all the way down to the little toe. Now you can see the big toe sticking out here to the side. But then right here, notice what happens. The heel comes up. The foot flexes right here. And now the weight's concentrated on that bone just in front of the heel bone. And so right behind here is the transverse tarsal joint, or the mid-tarsal braid. And then it pushes off from that point, and we get, the pressure up here. So here's, and the other question I had was, all right, the pressure plate shows that, the pressure pad rather shows that. What about in the footprints? Would the footprints of a chimpanzee leave any artifacts that might be similar to this pressure ridge? And so this is Jason. He's a very willing subject, young chimpanzee who loves to do these kinds of experiments because he gets to interact with his keeper and everything. So we set up a really simple experiment. I just built a wooden frame lined with visqueen and put some nice clean sandbox sand in it. And then, because of the regulations, I wasn't allowed to be in the enclosure with Jason at the same time as, or with Jason. He can only be in there with the keeper. And so the plan was, she would bring him in and have him make a pass on the sand. If there was enough room, maybe make a second pass. Then he'd go back into the holding cage, just to the outside here, and I would come in, take some photographs, take some measurements, and then I had a little rake. I would rake the sand clean and flat again, and then she would take him over it again. Well, it was funny because, poor Jason has been a laboratory chimp all his life. So all he's ever seen, he's never been outside. He's only seen linoleum, cyclone fencing, concrete, cinder block walls. So when he saw this sand, he was just mystified by it. And he walked up to it, he touched it very gingerly, he put his lips down to it, but he wouldn't step on it. and he would come, she would coax him with all kinds of goodies like kicks and Fruit Loops and hold it up to get him to walk bipedally. But he'd come, and just before he would take a step into the sandbox, he would move his foot over to the outside. So it took a little bit of training. We finally got him to do it, and made a nice clean pass, and left some very clear footprints. And then she signaled for him to go over to the holding cage. Well, now you put yourself in Jason's position. He looks forward to this time he gets to play with the keeper, and he does one pass, and she wants him to go back in the holding cage, which usually means it's time to go back to yourself. So he wouldn't go. He went to the opposite side of the pen and sat down there and just wouldn't move. And it took all kinds of coaxing. She threw handfuls of skittles and tricks and kicks and all sorts of things into the holding pen. Finally, he just couldn't take it. There was just too many goodies in there. And he reluctantly went in. And as he's stuffing his face, he watches me very carefully as I come and take these pictures. And then I take the rake and I very carefully rake the sand. And nice and flat. And then I step out, she brings him out, and he's looking at me, watching me, just like, you can see the wheels turn. And she makes another very nice pass of footprints, and then she signals for him to come into the holding cage. And he stands there, and he looks over at her, and he looks at the holding cage, he looks over at me, and waits for me, and he looks back at her, and he looks down at the footprints. He walks over with his fingers and goes, So, the reason I took the time to tell that little funny story is to also impress upon you, it doesn't take humanness to have insight and to have forethought and to do things that we think look human. These primates are extremely intelligent, they're extremely observant, they put things together, they've solved complex problems. Okay? So just a cautionary note. Alright, what we found was, it wasn't as clear-cut as I thought it might be, and the confounding factor was this divergent big toe, which is rather idiosyncratic. Some chimpanzees walk with their toe sticking right out, almost at right angles to the foot. Some of them walk with it lined up. I found the same thing with gorillas. When I went down, I would sit and watch the weather report. As soon as Salt Lake had a fresh snow, I got on the phone and told them I was coming down to the whole zoo, because they were going to let the gorillas walk around in the outer enclosure for half an hour and then bring them back in time for me to arrive and take photographs of the nice fresh footprints in the snow. because we didn't have any opportunity to do a sandbox with the gorillas. And the same thing, some of the individuals walk with their toes stuck straight out, some of them walk with it pointing straight, aligned with the other toes to a remarkable degree. But we did have some examples that did show, this is sort of what we call a pressure disc, where because of the texture and the clumping of the sand, the entire bit here was pushed back into the heel. But the release is in the proper place. It's in front of the transverse tarsal joint related to the mid-tarsal break. Now, when did the arch of the foot evolve? When did it appear in human evolution? And this is important because one of, he's a very friendly critic. He's a very open-minded, but he raised one criticism on camera about what he saw as the lack of congruence between a non-divergent big toe and the lack of an arch. He was saying the only reason you would have a flexible midfoot is if you had a divergent big toe for a grasping foot. Well, that's true. That's the original selection pressure, the original adaptation. But as I'll show you, there's actually already a precedent of a trend for reduced divergence of the big toe while still retaining the midfoot flexibility. If we look at the earliest hominids, this is an artistic reconstruction of Australopithecus afarensis and a mural that appeared in the American Museum of Natural History to explain these bipedal footprints that were found in East Africa about 3.5 million years old. And as I examined these in the course of my research studies, there was a feature that jumped out at me. And this was actually after I had already become a bit preoccupied with the Sasquatch tracks. And here's this ridge right here. When I first drew some attention to this and asked some of the people who'd actually worked on the footprints, one of them said, well, it's a termite burrow. They have these terrestrial termites that were burrowing through the ash, through the somewhat solidified ash, and they just happened to go right through the footprint. And this is like a molehill, in other words, where their little subterranean tunnel is located. But I found it in about 5 or 6 of the footprints. And I said, so you're going to tell me that in this line of footprints, there were 5 or 6 termite colonies, and they all intersected the footprint right precisely at that point along the length of the track? Well, and it's a little hard to swallow that one. And then one researcher had executed a reconstruction using composite elements of early hominid foot skeletal elements. And when he superimposed that on the Laetoli track, I've indicated in a red line where the transverse tarsal joint is, where the midfoot flexibility would be. And lo and behold, it coincides with the position of the pressure ridge. So again, what would the odds of this little hump there coincidentally occurring in multiple footprints and in precisely the position that corresponds with that joint that indicates a flexible midfoot? Pretty low. Then the clincher was this. I found someone who had a cast of this particular footprint, and I've drawn some points of congruence here between them so you can see. This out here is just kind of a plot of wet ash. See, this ash resulted from what's called a phreatic eruption, where very wet volcanic ash literally explodes from the steam energy, explodes and pulverizes the ash to fine texture, but still a lot of water content, which rains down across the landscape. And so it's like wet, floppy goo that quickly then hardens as the water evaporates. And but when these individuals walked through, it was still very viscous. And in places it squished up, extruded between the toes, or there were extrusion humps around the edge of the track. And right here is an extrusion front where the wet ash has been oozed back. This isn't an artifact of the excavation or anything else. It's actually where the ash is extruded back, and it corresponds in position to that termite burrow. The hump back here, a pressure ridge, and corresponds to the inferred position of the transverse tarsal joint. So the point is simply this. Humans don't leave that kind of a pressure ridge. If we leave a pressure release or a pressure disc, it will occur right behind the ball of the foot, right up here, not way back here in the midfoot. If we jump ahead in time by about 800,000 years, this is a specimen, a footprint that's attributed to Homo erectus in southern France. Here's the skeleton of Homo erectus. Homo erectus at this time was thought to be pretty modern in its manner of walking. It has much longer legs than its predecessors. There's been too much speculation, in fact, especially in the absence of the feet. But when we look at this footprint, it's remarkable that there is no distinguishing ball, there's no medial arch, the heel's quite long, and there's this material right here. You can see by the shadow how there's this even convexity, or concavity rather, through the forefoot, and then there's this hump right across that point there. And if we compare it to this track from the Patterson-Gimlin film site, lo and behold, it's remarkably similar. So my point is, this criticism that it's not reasonable to suggest that Bigfoot is walking around on two legs with a flat, flexible foot and a non-divergent big toe, because there is no precedent, is baseless. In fact, it appears that this was the adaptation of early hominids, stable adaptation for getting around on two legs that lasted for probably 3 to 5 million years. So to have a modern analog of that behavior is not really unusual at all. I'm going to jump through this part here and get to this. Okay. So here we've got an array of feet. This is a chimpanzee. This is a lowland gorilla, a mountain gorilla, which is larger, more terrestrial, spends much less time in the trees than its lowland cohorts. And this is a tracing of a Sasquatch footprint. This could be that one from Bluff Creek in 1958. But what I want to draw your attention to is several trends that are already evident amongst great apes that show an increasing gradation of commitment to living and walking on the ground. You get an elongation and a broadening of the heel. You get a reduction in the degree of divergence of the big toe, and you get a relative shortening of the lateral toes to resist bending stresses that are placed on those toes. When you look at the Sasquatch foot, it is a natural extension of those very trends. There's nothing extraordinary, nothing unusual about it whatsoever. All right. So, is there a potential paleontological candidate that could account for this kind of a trend being present in modern day? Well, of course, we've already talked about the possibility of Gigantopithecus. So here it is. This is Bill Munns. Bill Munns does anthropological reconstructions, and this is his interpretation of Gigantopithecus. And he's, we don't know limb proportions, we don't know hair color, we don't know skin tone, etc. But it still is impressive that even with these short hind legs, to look at his reconstructed size of this animal, it's impressive to convey the mass that a giant ape was able to attain, at least in the past, recognized in the past. Here's a mandible of a human and that of a Gigantopithecus, the white part being reconstructed. And then, of course, this is Dr. Grover Kranz's complete reconstruction of the skull. Again, it's speculative, but when you know the depth of the mandible, you can infer approximately the depth of the maxilla, and given the size of those jaws, you know that there had to be large attachments for muscles. And if you assume a brain the size of other apes, relative to body size, you have to have extra crests to accommodate the muscle mass on this large animal. But whatever the details might have been, again, it still conveys the immensity of the size of this animal by comparison to an adult male gorilla and a human here. Now, we do have skulls of early hominids that were also rather specialized for very coarse diets, and actually showed some of the adaptations of the jaws and teeth that are present in Gigantopithecus, but just not on such an immense scale. This is a robust Australopithecine They survived until about 1.2 million years ago, thereabouts, probably, or 2 million years ago. This one is Australopithecus or Paranthropus boisei. You can see the massive jaws, the heavy zygomatic arches, the ridges here. But what's uncanny to me is if you line it up to scale to Patty's portrait here, look at the congruence in the points. I mean, even down to the extreme flare of this gonial angle, this corner of the jaw, flaring out to give increased attachment for a very deep masseter muscle. And when you look at Patty, you can see the shadow, the marked shadow right here, that indicates the depth of that masseter muscle. But it clearly shows that Patty has the facial to cranial proportions that are very similar to these hominids and or apes that are adapted to a very coarse diet. Gigantopithecus has teeth that are both absolutely, but also relatively thicker than any other ape that ever existed. So it was really crunching up, capable of crunching up very heavy things. All right, we've already talked a little bit about the potential of Gigantopithecus as an antecedent, both for Sasquatch-like figures in eastern Asia, as well as going across the Bering Land Bridge to North America. So I think I'm going to skip over any more detail of that, but just to pick it up with the notion that if that were the case, if there was this giant ape that had migrated across the Bering Land Bridge, or extended its range through a contiguous habitat from Eastern Asia into North America, wouldn't we expect the indigenous populations to be aware of it? Wouldn't they have had contact, interaction with such a creature, or such a being, such an entity? And of course, there is ample evidence that, yes, in fact, they have. For example, the Bukwas tradition of the West Coast Native Americans, with their very stereotypical grimace, with the mouth pulled back, exposing these teeth. But notice the heavy brow, the flaring nostrils, the deep set eyes, and protruding lower face, the profusion of hair. Occasionally, there are less stylized representations of that native impression of this animal. And this is a very interesting specimen that predates Columbian contact, comes from British Columbia. It was analyzed by a colleague of mine who is an anthropologist at the American Museum of Natural History named Ross McPhee. He didn't realize he was evaluating it, and it wasn't for me, it was for another researcher who presented this discussion at the Man-Like Monsters on Trial Symposium, the conference at the University of British Columbia that was held a number of years ago. But he said, yes, this thing is remarkably similar to those key characteristics we would associate with a great ape. The prominent brow ridge, the deep set eyes, again the flaring nostrils, the depth between the nose, the nasal aperture, and the depth of the upper jaw, the distance between the mouth and the nose. And then notice that obviously a muscular face with flexion creases as it draws its lips back and squints its eyes. Flexion creases here across the muzzle. He said the only characteristic in which this diverges from a seeming typical representation of the great ape is the lack of the prominent projecting canine teeth. Now, if you were observant and you look carefully at that Gigantopithecus reconstruction, you would have noticed that the canine teeth didn't project. In fact, all the evidence from the few teeth that are known of Gigantopithecus suggests the canines wore end to end. And by adulthood, the points were worn off and the canines were even with the rest of the tooth row. Now again, what are the odds of a Native American artist representing in so many anatomically accurate features a great ape, except for that one, which just happens to agree with the dental anatomy of a Gigantopithecus that was thought to be extinct 300,000 years ago. Here's a more lifelike, another lifelike representation, not more than the other one, except that hair has been added. This is a more contemporary rendition by a native artist whose sibling had an encounter, and this was reconstructed life-size, and it was quite large. I can't remember the precise dimension. It's an interesting representation. DW, one of these times I'm going to zap you right in the eye with this laser. I'll apologize. All right, what about the film? Let's use the film as a jumping off point for the flip side of that coin. If the indigenous people have had contacts and have recorded those contacts through their native art, what about the European settlers and incursion of the European population? Well, here's an example. So what does this tell us? Of course, you may know the stories, the claims. There have been many, but the most recent, most publicized claim of the hoaxing of the Patterson-Gimlin film by Bob Hieronymus and the costume maker Philip Morris. Philip Morris is the owner of one of the largest companies manufacturing gorilla costumes that are sold off the shelf. This is, did I do it? Well, the previous picture, it's all right. The previous picture showed you what those costumes look like. That was a typical Philip Morris costume. Now, Philip Morris said when he saw the Patterson-Gimlin film displayed on the television, he sat up in his chair and immediately recognized that was one of his costumes. Well, you tell me, Well, then when he's pressed on that, he said, well, he must have modified it a little bit. He added the breasts, he changed the face, etc. And so when Hieronymus claimed that he was the man in the fursuit, and that he knew the suit's existence, when pressed to replicate that or produce the suit, bring it forward, of course he couldn't. It took them 8 months to reverse engineer a suit, and I mean that literally, reverse engineer, because it's clear that they looked at the Patterson-Gimlin film to inspire their engineering of the modifications to the costume. And this is what they came up with. I mean, the story, and I won't go into the details of the story, but just enough to show you that there's no merit to this claim whatsoever. Hieronymus made ridiculous claims that Hieronymus had one good eye and one glass eye. And he had a spare glass eye. I guess you have to divide it in pairs. So he had a spare one. And he claimed that this mask was actually built upon a football helmet. And that on he had one hole then to look through, and one hole that was covered, and they put a little modeling clay there, and he actually took his spare false eye, and stuck it in the clay so that it would catch the sun's glint and give a reflection, a little highlight in the film for realism. But then he acknowledged that he's looking through this other hole, he said, which was 2 inches away from his eye. Now you imagine, just go home and do this. Take a toilet paper roll, hold it up to your eye, and go walk out in the woods with it, with the other eye closed. But yet you watch Patty on the film, and not once does she look down at the placement of her feet. She's walking along very normally, very casually. The other thing, one more little red flag that was an immediate giveaway that Hieronymus was blowing. Hieronymus, like Patty, it's forward lean and it's kind of high stepping gait. He has kind of high hips and long legs. But one of the things that was a real giveaway is he would turn the palm of his hand around and point it back like this. Kind of walking like an Egyptian. Well, here's the reason he was doing that. When copies of the Patterson film were published, once Renee DeHinden had the rights to the licensing of the still images, Renee's copy of the film had a blemish on the picture. And I should have made a graphic for this, but can you go back 2 pictures to the image of the Patterson film? Next time you're thumbing through some of books that have pictures of not mine because they have the earlier or the correct version, but right here, not the one where he's holding a can of Spam, but the one where his hands come back. There's a circle right here, and it almost makes it look like Patty's making an OK sign, but with the palm of her hand sticking back like this. Well, that's the false impression that's created by that little blemish, that circular blemish. Without the blemish, it's obvious that the hand is just facing with the back of the palm outward, just like you would hold your hand when you're walking. But Hieronymus, trying to copy what he sees on the film, instead exaggerates the position of his hand and turns it back so that the palm is facing backward, based on these more prolific numbers of pictures that have been published in magazines and so forth of the film with the blemish. So there's clearly, just doesn't hold up at all. So here he is, Hieronymus in his suit. And of course they made it a little bit fuzzy to try to imitate the lack of clarity in the Patterson film. But you can see the lip proportions. I mean, you can see the lack of muscle definition. You can see, the lack of shoulder breadth for this larger head to make the face look much bigger than his, head sticking up in here. And then, of course, if you put it to scale, it doesn't hold a candle to it. There is no question that it's just a vacuous claim and no bearing. Some of the best corroborative evidence for the film, in my opinion, are the footprints. Again, from my perspective, especially. And Patterson cast a right and a left, and he picked the clearest, flattest example that he could find of the right and the left foot. That's good, and that's bad. The good thing is, it's a wonderful replica of the plantar surface of the foot. It's almost as if he made a mold of the foot itself. But the bad thing is, it doesn't show the types of dynamics you would typically expect to see in the footprint of a large animal walking across a sandbar. But they were there. He just overlooked those or passed those over to choose the examples that were the clearest. But when you looked at it, it did look something like a flat plank had made these tracks. And that was the reaction of most of the, quote, experts at the time. Or other critics, including some in the Bigfoot community, even would say that well, we really can't say that the footprints were left by the film subject. They could have been fabricated after the fact and artificially deepened in that way. Well, if you're familiar and look at the blow-ups of some of the frames in which we have very clear perspective on the sole of the foot, there's no question that they are made by, that the footprints are made by this foot. And then through some of M.K. Davis's work and carefully scrutinizing individual frames, he was able to find frames that do in fact show footprints in the ground as Patty is walking away from the camera. So that issue can be laid to rest. To suggest that some simplistic modification, this is the off-the-shelf feed of one of Philip Morris's costumes with a gorilla-like, somewhat gorilla-like divergent big toe. Even substituting it for this, it could not account for the dynamics that are present in the footprints. The Monday following the filming on Friday, Lyle Laverty, who was a timber cruiser for the U.S. Forest Service at the time, marking trees for this salvage operation that was taking place in the Bluff Creek Canyon. While in town over the weekend with his summer crew, heard the stories and the ruckus about Patterson's film. And he said, well, you know where that's at. In fact, we're camped not too far from there. So they stopped by the site, and he went and examined and had a camera and snapped a series of pictures of the footprints. And these do show, instead of having the nice flat surfaces, they do show disruption. Pressure discs push back into the posterior part of the foot. Here's another one. You can again see this pressure disc, all this material where it's buckled and pushed back. Here's a pressure ridge, has a disc here. And then after about 10 days, Bob Titmus, who by now had moved up to live near John Green in British Columbia, had driven all the way back down and brought up a couple of companions along with him, and he had enough plaster with him to make casts of 10 successive footprints, irregardless of their quality. And interestingly, the 10 that he made included several of those that were photographed by Laverty. Lyle Laverty is now the director of parks in Colorado State. I spoke to him on the phone about the time I was writing my book. He stands by his recollection of the events. He arrived at the scene. He saw the tracks were clearly evident across the sandbar, horse tracks milling here and there, boot prints, cowboy boot prints of Bob and Roger, and nothing else. No indications of multiple passes or retakes of the film or fabrication of tracks. Everything was as Roger had described, according to him. And he stands by that to this day. And this one, which proved to be an extremely important one. Now, for a long time, people saw this stuff sticking out the side here of the sand and assumed that there was a branch under the sand right here that the foot had stepped over and conformed to. But there's no relationship of this to this, and this is a pressure ridge, as can be seen by these expansion cracks, and they're documented in their footprint, again, of which there's an example on the back table. So that's one feature. Now, in my remaining few minutes, I want to kind of rattle through very quickly some other correlated features. We already talked about the flexibility of the transverse tarsal joint and its role in the pressure ridge. But I have to say, again, one of the criticisms that has been raised by another academic who's written a book called Bigfoot Exposed, which is an interesting, enlightening book to read, although I don't know if I would recommend it, because unless you understand all the flaws, there's a mistake or a misstatement, literally, on every single page. I've reviewed his book. I wrote an extensive review that was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. And the review ended up being 11 pages long. And it's very unusual for a review of a book. But I discussed it with the editor. I said, there is just so much misinformation in this book that it really needs to be enumerated. And he agreed. And so made the unprecedented decision to publish an 11-page book review. But one of the criticisms, he took exception to my interpretation on my arrow. Well, no, that's fine. Interpretation of this, and he goes, look, he said, I can walk in sand and create the same thing. Well, it just shows his lack of understanding of what I'm describing here, because this is not the same thing. The deepest point of this footprint is right here at the ball of the foot. Most of this is just material that has not been compacted because this individual has a well-developed arch. And the rest of the cracks and so forth are from pressure that's translocated through this entire space here. You can see the crack right there. It's a disc. So this whole thing is a pressure disc that originated behind the ball of the foot. The deepest point of this track is right here. In this case, under the navicular, the bone just in front of the transverse tarsal joint. And the pressure ridge emanates from that point, not from up here at the ball of the foot. Well, there is no ball, as in the human foot. Here again, we showed this last time, but you can see the heel coming up. Here you can actually see the mid-tarsal break occurring in the film subject itself. So I think that inference is accurate. Oh, now, if you notice that in that image, how light the bottoms of the feet were. A real common criticism has always been, it looks like slippers. It looks like fake feet. These bright, white, unnatural-looking things. Well, how unnatural do they look? Here is a shot of a chimpanzee walking. And the soles of the feet, the margins of the soles, the hair contact, the margin of the hair on the leg, looks identical. Looks just the same. There's nothing unnatural about that. In some frames, the sole of the foot is a little bit overexposed, which kind of inflates it. Makes it look a little puffy and fuzzy-edged. But in those frames where the exposure is more appropriate, it's dead on. All right, and then remember, last time we drew attention not only to this trailing foot showing the transverse tarsal break, but we also drew your attention to these toes, these long toes out front here. So here you can see, well, two things. I guess I got a little bit ahead of myself. Here's an image that critics have looked at and said, well, look, you can see how the false foot sticks out beyond where it should, beyond the ankle. The foot is attached, the ankle is attached way too far forward, and the fake foot sticks back here. Well, the explanation for that had some interesting corroboration in the Skookum cast. Now, the Skookum cast is just obtuse enough that it isn't really useful information. Its significance is lost on most observers because they can't interpret what's going on. It just looks like a hodgepodge bunch of strange things, but the thing that jumps out like a neon light is this Achilles tendon and a heel impression back here. And when you look at that, this is Rick Knoll's heel, which he molded. And when you put it side by side, you can see, here's the Achilles tendon, here's the broad heel. It's a little bit lumpy here because a coyote walked across the imprint after the fact and stepped right down in that imprint of the heel. Here it is from another perspective that even makes it more dramatic. Notice this deep undercut here. That's that space between the Achilles tendon and the shin bone, the back of the shin bone, or the tibia. And the reason the undercut is so much more evident than it is here is because of this elongation of the heel to increase the leverage for the massive body weight of this animal. By increasing the leverage, you displace the Achilles tendon further from the shin bone. When that tendon's relaxed, the heel looks more prominent. And it has a deeper undercut back here because there's just nothing back there. Basically, but a little bit of fat and a couple of nerves and arteries. You can see that same progression if we go from a gibbon to a chimpanzee to a gorilla. As body mass increases, the length of the lever increases. And Sasquatch simply takes that same trend a couple of steps further. Now here we go. Look at the toes. Like I said, I got ahead of myself. Look at the toes, the long upper pointing toes. Here's an artist's reconstruction of that. This is Brendan Bannon, Toes are dorsiflexed, pointing up, and then as it steps down, the toes flex downward. Now here's the advantage of Rogers' cast that was so clear. It's so clear, in fact, you can see the indentation right here that indicates the point of this. It indicates the point of the flexion crease, or it indicates the flexion crease that corresponds to the joint here at the base of the toe. Now, yesterday I was talking about the stubby toes versus long toes. Because the sole pec comes up quite high, the toes look kind of stubby, but in reality they're pretty long. They're about 10 to 15% longer than most human toes are by comparison to the rest of the foot. So there's another distinctive feature. Those long toes are permissible because the push-off comes from right here. In humans, we've concentrated it up here. So the toes take more of the push-off pressure. And as a result, they're drastically shortened by comparison to, say, a chimpanzee to resist bending stresses that would be placed on them. Here's another example. In one of those footprints that I examined, going back to Walla Walla again, this one was deep enough that the toes had splayed just a little bit. And by an in-splaying had pressed into the sidewall of this 2-inch deep track. And so for the first time ever that I was aware of, you could see the profile of the little toe. And it was a long toe. That toe on a 15-inch track was as long as my pinky finger. Now that's a lot longer than your little toe would be if we elongated your foot to 15 inches. Those toes on that foot would have as much prehensile capability as the fingers on my hand, and yet be combined with the muscle mass of the lower leg of a Sasquatch. So imagine the strength of those toes. It's really quite amazing. Now I didn't show it here, but if you flip it around, you can see the big toe, and clearly see that the big toe only had 2 bones in it. Now how many of you knew that your thumb, as well as your big toe, only has 2 bones, or phalanges, whereas all the remainder have 3? You better raise your hand. You're senior biologist. Not many people did know that, and Paul Freeman certainly didn't know that. And yet this track clearly exhibited that anatomical point of trivia very dramatically. In fact, Sasquatch toes, here we've got a figure which shows in the solid bar this length out here to the base of the metatarsus. And then the arrows here indicate the length of the 3rd digit. And if we take some, and these are estimates, a small sample of Sasquatch tracks where we can get that kind of data reasonably accurately, you see that its toe length falls intermediate between a bipedal hominid and modern humans. But if you take into account the extremely elongated heel, which kind of swamps out this a little bit, if we scaled that segment more equally with these, you'd see that the toes were actually closer to that of an Australopithecine, another hominid that walks with flat, flexible feet, although bipedal, but much smaller. Now here's an interesting one. These are the famous Bosberg tracks. These are also back on the table, which exhibits in the right foot an interesting pathology, a form of pes cavus, or skew foot, where either through, well, there's several possibilities, a congenital deformity, a crushing injury, or, as was suggested by a relative of mine who is an orthopedic surgeon, it could be a spinal cord lesion that causes a neuropathy that induces the hypertrophy of soft tissue and constriction and contraction of connective tissue that twists the foot into a bent shape, and in so doing pulls the bones apart so that these bunionettes, like the bunions you get on the big toe and it gets pushed the wrong direction, but here on the outside edge of the foot form. Now Grover had drawn attention to these and pointed out that they were too far forward for this to be just simply an enlarged human foot, indicating a much longer heel segment. This is my own reconstruction because Grover had argued, not recognizing the midfoot flexibility, he thought that the forefoot functioned more like a modern human, and therefore with its greater mass, that Sasquatch would have much shorter toes. But having midfoot flexibility, sparing the toes, allowing them to be longer as prehensile organs. In reality, when I had the chance to look at the originals of these, which those casts back there are molded from, it became very clear that the placement of this joint, and I'm losing power here, placement of that joint was further back than Grover had allowed. But the point is, the placement of the transverse tarsal joint is precisely the right place. Now here's the quick little interesting side story, if you'll indulge me just for a minute. I sent a photograph, this very photograph, to my distant second cousin, a Meldrum who was over here in North Carolina, in fact, doing a residency. His specialty was hip and knee replacements, but he was more than happy to look at this for me. And I said, I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about it, but just look at it, tell me what you think. He phones back rather promptly, and he said, yeah, this foot here, the left foot, which appears on the right, the cast, he said, it looks pretty normal, except the heel's a bit long, the proportions are kind of interesting. He said, but this is a clear case of pes cavus. And he said, if I was presented with a patient exhibiting this unilateral manifestation of this, I would immediately send them for a spinal MRI. Because almost certainly they were going to have something going on with their spinal cord. A tumor, for example, that was pressing on the cord and causing these neuropathic changes in the foot down there at the far end. And then he said something that kind of surprised me. He said, well, you know where this was taken and when. Could you go to the local hospital and have them check their record to see if there was somebody with a deformity that had a spinal MRI? And I said, well, Russell, I could, but the guy would have to have 17-inch feet. And there's this silence on the other end of the line. He goes, well, that's right, that's right. He was so comfortable with the anatomy he was examining that he totally overlooked the fact that these things are 17 inches long. About 2 weeks later, I got a call from his boss, who was the specialist in foot reconstruction. We talked for about an hour about the anatomy and its possible interpretation, and then he closed by saying, I hope you don't mind, but I framed your photograph and it hangs in my office, so whenever I take new residents on rounds, we stop and I have them evaluate this case. So can you imagine trying to explain how to? So, and yet, Dr. Dagley would have you believe that somebody with no past experience could walk into a medical school library, open up an orthopedic textbook, trace the deformed foot of an infant to get the unusual proportions, and simply blow it up and go out and make over 1,000 footprints through mud and snow and underwater in Bosburg, Washington, to be discovered by Renee Hinden and Ivan Marks. Now, here's something that we can end on that I'm sure you haven't seen. One of the benefits of having these critics throw stones is that it motivates us to look at things with a renewed perspective and with new technologies. And, another thing to bear in mind, the critics often, and even Dr. Daglin fell prey to this, because I think he was working off of a VHS copy of the film that Renee Hinden provided him, that he makes comments in his books about the film being so blurry and so fuzzy, you can't even make out facial features, which just simply isn't true. He just was working with a very poor specimen. A very clean first-generation copy of the film was photographed micrographically with a high-resolution digital imagery by Rick Knoll. He completely constructed his apparatus to do this himself with good technology. And then realizing that Patterson had taken the film on a camera that had a lens that was not corrected for chromatic aberration, which simply means that due to that lens, the lower quality of that lens, as color passed through it, colored light, the different wavelengths would be refracted slightly differently. And so certain colors, certain wavelengths, would focus on the film precisely, while others would be slightly offset, rendering the image in that color slightly out of focus. So by splitting that information by color channel in the computer, one can subtract away the fuzziness and leave a sharper image that has a little less information, maybe, because the limitation of the wavelength, but nevertheless a crisper, sharper image. And then those were rendered in grayscale, and then stabilized, and then MK Davis picked it up from there and stabilized the images and strung them together. And here they're being played at 18 frames per second, which was the film speed that Grover had settled upon based on an independent assessment of the pendulum moment arm of the swing of the arm. Most of the time, or often when you see it, or used to see it on TV, they're a little more conscientious about it now, but they would always play it at 22 frames per second, which was the typical broadcast rate. But then it would look like Keystone Cops. It would be herky-jerky, walking along really funny looking. And an interesting side note, Dr. Don Greaves, a biomechanist from London, England, University College of London, had concluded, based on his analysis, if it was filmed at 22 frames per second, that a human might be able to replicate that particular style of gait. But at 16 or 18 frames per second, 16 was the actual setting, but Grover had the camera, had examples of that camera model analyzed, and the range of variance on the actual film speed with the film set at 16 frames per second was anywhere from about 15 to 19 frames per second. So his assessment of 18 frames per second is justifiable. If it was filmed at 18 frames per second, it was extremely unlikely. He left the back door open. He said a dancer, for example, with a lot of practice might be able to mimic such a gait. But it was extremely unlikely that a human was capable of executing that gait in a convincing manner. But at this film speed, you get the sense of the mass, the inertia of this unhumanly massive body form, which does exceed human dimensions in all directions. But the way to look at it is to pick out one spot. Look at the neck here. You can see again, remember we talked about the massive face compared to the head. That makes balancing the head over the spine rather different, especially when you're leaning forward at 5 degrees all the time. And so the muscles in the shoulders are much more massive and attach on the skull considerably higher than they do in a human. They're not up underneath the skull, they're up at the back of the skull. Not quite as high as that of a gorilla. Notice as it turns to look back at you, there are no folds or wrinkles evident around the neck or the shoulder, which is the weak point of any costume. If you look down, and I'll hurry here because we're running out of time. If you look down, you can see the shoulder blades sliding under the skin very clearly. You can see the outline of the deltoid. You can see the definition of the individual heads of the triceps. You can look at the trapezius coming down as a triangle down the center of the back, and the deep furrow indicating, well, in fact, there where it turns, you can see the depth of the erector spinae muscles, the column of muscles on either side of the spine, which again, when they're leaning forward, are massively built and taut. You can see the definition in the quadriceps, the rectus femoris, and so forth. Not to mention what's taking place down below the knee, which I'm most interested in. We've already talked about the aspects of the feet. You can see the heads of the gastrocnemius. You can see the attachment of the, I'm starting to sound more and more like an anatomist. The point is, you can see those anatomical details. You see the attachment of the hamstrings on just below the knee. You can see all those details. On Hieronymus' costume, you can see that. Foam rubber just doesn't cut it, doesn't project that through. So, two of the most convincing pieces of evidence, in my opinion, still remain. The composite story told by all of the correlated footprints, credible footprints, and there are hoaxes, because they're rare. They're much rarer than most. When people ask me, how many, in your collection of 200 casts, how many are hoaxes? Half? And I say, I don't think so, I can only point to maybe a half a dozen. that I know for certain are hoaxes. There are some that are ambiguous because they're isolated, they don't have context, they don't show a lot of dynamic features, but yet their overall anatomy, proportions, and shape are very consistent with others that do. And the film, which after 40 plus years still stands as one of the most convincing photographic evidences for the existence of this animal. And with each renewed scrutiny, it comes out even shinier than it did before. So thank you very much for your attention.